Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part one of European Settlement of North America recorded lecture. And so, in this one, I'm going to be talking about, well, really, a lot of this is talking about what the colonial empires look like for Spain, France, and the Dutch or the Netherlands. And sometimes we call it Holland. That's what it was called at that day in time in history. And then eventually later we're going to get to the first English settlement in Jamestown, and then the Puritans and Pilgrims and all that. So to really establish colonies in North America, you really had to endure a long voyage over stormy and dangerous waters. It's not they don't have steam powered ships at this time that get you across the Atlantic in a matter of days. This took weeks, and many died along the way, while others were weakened by spoiled food, excuse me, and shipboard diseases immediately, and had to, as soon as they got there, had to immediately build shelters and plant crops, which was quite a task. Many also faced hostile Indian peoples where they were, depending on where they settled, and at times, depending on conflict with Native Americans, what that actually looked like. Still, despite great risk and uncertain rewards, English, French, and Spanish migrants by the tens of thousands crossed the Atlantic during the 17th century. They were either driven by poverty and religious persecution at home, or drawn by the promise of lands, gold, or to evangelize the natives. For Native Americans, the European invasion was a catastrophe. Whether they came as settlers, missionaries, or fur traders, the white-skinned people brought new diseases and religions that threatened Indians' lives, lands, and cultures. And so, but I do want to emphasize the chance that Europeans had in North America, that they and really even in Central and South America, they had really nowhere else in Europe. You could, from the old kind of landed nobility and so forth that had taken place in the centuries before in Europe. If you were a small farmer that owned your own land, that was kind of the Spanish or the French or the Dutch dream. And so a lot of people that were tenant farmers, those that didn't own their own land and worked for somebody else for meager wages and so forth, the chance to go to another area, no matter what the risk was for them, was worth it, because they had a chance to do something they did not have a chance in their home country, and that's a chance to own land. Some are going to go to try to strike it rich, like some of the Spanish conquistadors had done when they conquered the Aztecs and Incas Empire. Some are going to go as missionaries. They're Christians, either Protestants or Catholics, who are going to go out and try to evangelize and convert Native Americans to Christianity. And whatever reason they came, they did take great risk in going across the Atlantic. So let's look at what the Spanish Empire looked like. We call it New Spain. Okay, so you see that typically in a textbook is what is New Spain. That is the Spanish colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. So in Mesoamerica, this means Central America, the Spanish seized the Native Americans' lands, converted them to Catholicism, and made them dig for gold and farm large estates. In the more sparsely populated eastern regions of North America, the French and Dutch merchants created fur trading colonies, and the native peoples retained their lands and political autonomy. Wherever they lived, their numbers diminished, mostly from disease, and they lost land over time. Okay, so let's look at what New Spain looked like. Remember, this is U.S. history. If this was world history, we would talk a lot more about Central and South America, what that looked like, and Spanish colonial history, but this is U.S. history, and so we're going to focus on primarily North America. So I want to show you this. This is right before the 7 Years' War map. So New Spain consists of mostly Mexico, but into the southern portion of Texas, into New Mexico, up to Santa Fe, which my wife and I were there a couple summers ago, and along the coast of California. France is technically going to claim all of this. Doesn't mean they occupied that. But you had fur trappers that went out, but they had a few settlements along the Mississippi River and around the Great Lakes, as we'll see. And then primarily where the most French Canadians live is right here, along the St. Lawrence River Valley. The British, on their hands, are going to actually bring the greatest population of the three. The Dutch are going to settle in present-day New York along the Hudson River, but they don't make a very large settlement. The Dutch are going to have a sugar colony down in the Caribbean, but also the Dutch are going to be involved in trading in the Indian Ocean trade and set up trade settlements there, and trade with Japan and so forth. You look at the Hudson Bay Company. This is a joint stock company, and I'll explain what a joint stock company is in a later lecture. And it's kind of like an early form of a corporation. Then you even see Russia all the way up here in Alaska. Remember this, because later in 1867, the U.S. is going to purchase Alaska from Russia because it was originally a fishing and logging colony for Russia. So we've talked about the explorations and so forth, but the French are going to explore up in this region, okay? And Henry Hudson, who sailed for England, is going to explore up in the Hudson Bay. And then at one point, his crew get frozen in because the Hudson Bay freezes in the winter, and they end up killing Henry Hudson for doing that. But before he'd done that, he had also explored what up the Hudson River, which was named after him, that flows in New York City today. And so let's look at the Spanish colonial cycle. Okay, so when Spain comes in 1492, of course, Columbus was the first Spanish explorer, but other explorers primarily came a lot in the 1500s. You see, Ponce de Leon, Coronado, Pizarro, Cortez, and so forth. And they typically would bring in conquistadors, these Spanish kind of like hired mercenaries and so forth, who had fought, a lot of them had fought in the Reconquista against the Moors of Granada. And these conquistadors are going to end up conquering and subduing these Native American civilizations. And so what would end up happening is the King of Spain would give a land grant to the conquistador, okay? And it's what's going to be called the encomienda system. I'm going to have another slide, but you're going to have to know the encomienda system. It will appear on your first test. It also will appear on a quiz, usually. And if you have me for world history too, we would talk about, and that would appear on that test, one of those tests as well, because the encomienda system is tremendously important. When I taught AP world history, I'd always tell students, it's not a matter of if, but when you're going to be asked about the encomienda system on the AP exam. And so what the encomienda system consists of, it didn't last for a terribly long time, is the conquistador would be given a land grant from the king. Okay, so anybody who was on that land, they could have them as forced laborers, almost like Native American slaves, and that's exactly what it was like. But their responsibility was, if they're going to have them as free labor, basically, then it's their job to evangelize and convert them to Christianity, and also teach them Spanish and culture and European ways and so forth. But really, conquistadors just wanted to make a profit. There was some conquistadors who later in life regretted some of their brutality and kind of turned a 180 or whatever, but for the most part, that was not the case. But missionaries are the ones who are these Catholic priests. They're coming out of this Catholic Reformation with religious fervor, the Franciscan friars, the Dominican priests, and particularly the Jesuits. The Jesuits are probably the most well-known group, and there's a lot of Jesuit schools around the United States today. The Jesuits, a lot of them are going to go to Asia and evangelize into Japan, China, Philippines, and other places like that. The Jesuits do come, particularly French Jesuits, come to North America. But in the Spanish lands, particularly in the American Southwest, it's primarily Franciscan. And that's a Catholic priest order that are going out from the Catholic Reformation to evangelize. Some of the Catholic priests were very kind to the Native Americans. Others were not. It was really kind of a case-by-case basis. I remember studying this in grad school. You can't really group that all these Catholic priests were brutal to the Indians, but you can't always say that they were all nice and good to them either. And so it kind of just depends on where you were and who the priest was and so forth. But after the missionaries would come in, these permanent settlers would follow, and they would build these presidios, these military kind of compounds. You ever been to the Alamo in San Antonio? Huge tourist trap, kind of a letdown. There's some really cool missions outside of San Antonio, and I've toured with my family when I was a kid, and thought it was really neat and really cool walled compounds. You can see some of these presidios you can tour in California as well. So these permanent settlements, particularly in the northern part of New Spain, which would be the southwest part of the United States, are not going to have large populations. Okay, they had like 3,000 in New Mexico total. And so most of the Spanish settlers are going to be coming to central Mexico, what is now Mexico City. And a lot of them also going to go to Lima, which was, you kind of had almost like two capitals of the new Spanish Empire. You had Mexico City in central Mexico, and then Lima down in Peru. And then also Santo Domingo on the present-day country of Dominican Republic today. But when the Spanish come in, along with also the Portuguese do this as well, They create a colonial class system. Now, in world history, this was always on a test and always on the AP exam. But in U.S. history, you have to know this as well. And this colonial class system, it's based on race. It's not based on economic class, which usually, oftentimes, your race would determine your economic class, with the exception of the top two tiers. And so, if you were a peninsular, you were Spanish born. You were born in Spain, or if you were in Brazil, you were born in Portugal. Okay, you held the highest status in society, even if you weren't the wealthiest. Okay, because you were born in Spain. The second would be, which was the Creoles, and I'm sorry, it's actually a typo there. It's just Spanish people. Okay, and the Spanish or Portuguese were those that were Europeans who were born in the colonial class system. Okay, and I apologize for the typo there. I'll update that in the PowerPoint and so forth. But they're just Spanish born in the colonies. So the Peninsulars kind of look down on the Creoles because they weren't born in Spain. They're not as elite as them. Okay, even if their parents were both European. Because there were so few women that come over that are from Spain or Portugal, these conquistadors oftentimes would marry influential Native American wives, those that were the daughters of rulers and so forth, or nobles of the Aztecs and Incas and so forth. Well, they would have mixed race children. Okay, and they were called mestizos. They were Spanish or Portuguese and Indian mixture. The mulattoes were Spanish or Portuguese who married African women and so forth that were brought over through slavery. Okay, and so you had what's called mulatto children. They were white American and black mixture and so forth. And so they were below the Creoles in this class system and below the Peninsulars, but they were above pure-blooded Native Americans and pure-blooded black slaves. Okay. Now, the Catholic Church, I cannot understate its importance to New Spain and also its importance in Brazil for the Portuguese. They began building incredible Catholic cathedrals and churches and so forth. Catholicism even added a new patron saint for Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, and it was the Virgin of Guadalupe. And this was done to try to convert Native Americans to Catholicism and so forth. And one of the things that you'll need to kind of understand is a unique thing with Latin American Catholicism is you don't see the Virgin of Guadalupe as seen as a saint anywhere else in Catholicism in the world except in Latin America. This right here at the bottom is an example of a Spanish mission or a presidio. It would have had a wall compound. So remember, the Spanish are going to try to bring in Native Americans to their civilization and try to kind of force them to assimilate into Spanish / European culture and convert to Catholicism. Now, one of the history's good guys is Bartolomé de las Casas. He was actually a conquistador as a young man, but actually left that and became a famous Catholic priest. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas, when I taught AP World History, we'd always read some primary sources from Bartolomé de las Casas. The reason why he would appear frequently on tests and so forth, because they would show a quote and show that not all the Spanish thought the Native Americans were these uncivilized barbarians. This guy viewed them as very sophisticated and equal to the Spanish. They just had different cultures and so forth. And he wanted to educate Native Americans and to convert them to Christianity. And he was well thought of by both the Spanish and Native Americans for his kindness. Now, one of the things that ends up happening is he travels back to Spain, and because he's mortified at what he sees with the brutal encomienda system of forced labor for these Native Americans. And he convinces the Spanish king, and he argues against some of his rivals, that this encomienda system is not Christian, it's inhumane, and so forth. And so the king actually listens to him and gets rid of the encomienda system. And so what ends up happening is now, instead of the Native Americans being kind of like slave labor to the conquistadors or their descendants, now they're going to be like tenant farmers. Okay, so it goes from this encomienda system to what we call the hacienda system. And they're large ranches and so forth of farming, kind of like a feudal system. The problem is, though, is sugar is starting to take off in the Caribbean in the 1500s. And the Spanish king was like, well, what are we going to do for our labor? If we can't enslave Native Americans, then who's going to be our cheap labor source? Well, they decided to go with African slaves. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas was originally okay with it, because he saw a chance to lead them to Christianity. The problem is when he travels back, he sees the brutality of African slavery, and he's mortified at what he sees, and he spends the rest of his life trying to get slavery outlawed in the Spanish colonial empire, and he fails at doing that. But he was a champion of the people and so forth, and viewed Native Americans and Africans as equal to the Europeans. Okay, so in a ceaseless quest for gold, Spanish explorers penetrated deeply into the southern and western areas of what would become the United States. They're looking for gold and silver and stuff like that. So we talked about Coronado exploring into the American Southwest, into the Great Plains areas, and we talked about Hernan de Soto coming into the American Southeast, including actually went through Arkansas. He ended up fighting with the Appalachians in northern Florida and the Cusas in northern Alabama, but found no gold. He died in 1542, but some of his men made it back. And by the 1560s, Spanish officials kind of gave up for the search of Indian gold and focused on the defense of their empire. During this time, English, what they called sea dogs, were plundering Spanish treasure ships in Caribbean seaports, while French Protestants were settling in Florida despite Spain's claim there. And one of the reasons why the French Protestants come there is because there was a lot of religious wars taking place in France between Catholics and Protestants, which was actually quite nasty. And so if you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, obviously it's a fictional story, but England did send quite a few pirates to kind of plunder the Spanish galleons, which are carrying lots of gold and silver back either to Spain or all the way to the Philippines to trade with China for Chinese luxury goods such as silk and porcelain. And so after King Philip II's order to remove the French Protestants from Florida, this led to Spanish troops killing about 300 of the French settlers. Spain established the first European settlement at St. Augustine in 1565 and tried to keep out the French. Raids by the Colossus and Timacuas wiped out dozens other Spanish military outposts in Florida, and the Algonquins destroyed Jesuit religious missions along the East Coast, one as far north as Chesapeake Bay. And so Native Americans are going to resist the Europeans initially. So let's look at the Franciscan missions. These were basically, after Spain is defeated with the Pueblo Revolt and also had some setbacks for Native Americans, they decided to adopt a new policy towards Indian peoples, one of Christianization. They wanted to convert them to Christianity and kind of create alliances with them. The comprehensive orders for new discoveries issued in 1573 placed responsibility for pacification of new lands primarily in the hands of missionaries, not conquistadors. Over the next century, dozens of Franciscan friars set up missions, which were also called presidios, among the Appalachians in Florida and the Pueblos in Nuevo Mexico, which is basically Spanish for New Mexico. Although the friars often learned Indian languages, they systematically attacked the natives' cultures, such as polygamy, religious idols, etc. For the Franciscans, religious conversions, cultural assimilation, and forced labor went hand in hand. And they encouraged the Indians to talk, cook, dress, and walk like Spaniards. So they taught them Spanish, and that's why the majority of Latin America today speaks Spanish. And then you look at Brazil, it speaks Portuguese. So kind of what Spain does, Portugal does as well. And so the mission/presidios depended on Indian workers to grow crops and carry them to market. Okay. Let's talk about Pape and the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. I mentioned it in a previous recorded lecture, but I want to actually spend a little more time on it. And so, because this is one of the great Native American revolts of world history. Native Americans initially tolerated the Franciscans because they feared military reprisals and hoped to learn from the friars. Although European diseases took their toll, as well as droughts because they're living in the American Southwest, and raids by nomadic Apaches and Pawnees, however, led many Pueblo people to return to their ancestral religions. In 1598, the tense relations between Indians and Spaniards in New Mexico exploded into just bloodshed. Basically, what ends up happening is an expedition of 500 Spanish soldiers and settlers led by Juan de Oñate seized corn and clothing from Pueblo peoples and murdered or raped those who resisted. Indians retaliated by killing 11 soldiers, but the Spanish then killed 500 men and 300 women and children. Faced with bitterly hostile native peoples, most of the settlers left New Mexico. A lot of them went to El Paso, San Antonio, they went all the way back to Mexico City. In 1610, the Spanish returned, found the town of Santa Fe, which is a beautiful place you get a chance to go, great food too, and reestablished a system of missions and forced labor. Of the next two generations, European diseases, forced tribute, and raids by nomadic plains Indians reduced the population of Pueblo peoples from 60,000 to just 17,000. Pope led the natives to revolt once more, and in 1680, in a carefully coordinated rebellion, Pope and his followers from 24 Pueblo villages killed more than 400 Spaniards and forced the remaining 1,500 colonists and about 500 Pueblo and Apache slaves to flee 300 miles to El Paso. Repudiating Christianity, the Pueblo people desecrated churches and tortured and killed 21 missionaries. A decade later, Spain reasserted its control over the Pueblo people. The Pueblo revolted again in 1696, but were unsuccessful. They eventually accepted peace by getting rid of forced labor and were able to practice their own religion, while in return they would provide protection from raids by the Comanches and Apaches. The Comanches were very, very fierce tribe. Spain had maintained its northern empire, but it failed to convert and assimilate the Indian peoples. Some natives had married Spaniards, and their offspring formed a bicultural mestizo population. However, most Pueblo Indians continued to practice their old ways. And in Florida, settlements north of St. Augustine were discouraged due to English raids from South Carolina during colonial wars. And this delayed settlement of California as a result of that. Now we're going to cover the French in the next part.